In December of 2002, my close friend Richard was tying the knot. I had moved away from the peninsula a few years earlier and hadn't met his bride, but they'd been together for quite some time. Against my advice, Richard had joined the Marines, and this wedding marked a poignant prelude to his first tour in Iraq. Two of my other best friends, Till and Westy, also returned to our hometown of Port Angeles for the ceremony. The night before the wedding, we had a great time, and the next morning, we embarked on a 50-mile drive to Forks for the courthouse ceremony. However, our journey got off to a rocky start as my car suffered a flat tire. Forced to continue at a snail's pace on my spare, we narrowly avoided being late. The wedding itself was a lovely affair, and afterward, we headed to the bride's grandmother's house for the reception. As the festivities extended well into the night, the prospect of driving back to Port Angeles on a spare tire became too risky. The bride suggested we crash at her other grandmother's cabin, situated about 15 minutes outside of town. This cabin, despite being referred to as such, was more of a two-story house, and with most of the furniture removed, it had an eerie emptiness. The bride warned us about her uncle, a bit eccentric and still grappling with the death of his mother, the bride's other grandmother. She emphasized that if he found us there, he'd be furious. Despite the unsettling information, Westy and I had to choose between staying in the cabin with heat or braving the freezing outdoors. Richard and his new wife left for their wedding night, leaving us to contemplate where to hide if the eccentric uncle paid a visit. Upon exploring, we found a wardrobe in the bedroom, emptied of its contents and forming a makeshift nest in the middle of the room. The bride mentioned her uncle's preference for sleeping in a pile of his deceased mother's clothes. With no knives in the kitchen, I found a wood-splitting maul on the porch, just in case. As we settled into the attic for the night, we heard a disconcerting noise, the doorknob downstairs being violently shaken. We exchanged wide-eyed glances and listened intently. The noise persisted, sounding like a series of attempts to force the door open. After a while, it ceased, only to be replaced by the slam of the refrigerator and the screeching of chairs being moved across the floor. With no voices accompanying the sounds, we grew anxious. Armed with the maul, we waited in silence, but the eerie noises eventually subsided. Unable to sleep, we resorted to whispering about old times, fueled by the remnants of malt liquors from the previous night. Suddenly, we heard a ringing, echoing through the silent cabin. The noise seemed to emanate from a rotary phone in the kitchen, an old relic seemingly from the 60s. I picked it up, and the ringing stopped, but there was no dial tone. Stranger still, the phone wasn't plugged into the wall. The night continued with a bizarre phone that rang incessantly, reaching a count as high as 170 rings. I laid down on the mattress and eventually drifted off, only to wake up early the next morning, freezing and bewildered. Westy and I decided to search for another phone, but to our surprise, the only one on the property was the unplugged one in the kitchen. It left us with an unsettling mystery, a phone that rang without any logical explanation, adding an eerie layer to an already strange night in the cabin. In the fall of 2011, at the age of 16, I found myself back on the Algonquin First Nation reservation in Canada. Living in a nearby city for better educational opportunities during the week, I would return every weekend to spend time with my dad and little brother. Little did I know that one of those weekends would be etched into my memory forever, marked by a series of paranormal events that unfolded on the reservation. It all started innocently enough. My dad and his cousin, both cops on the res, were sitting at the kitchen table with a couple of beers when we walked in. It was a Friday evening, and their tired and drained expressions hinted at a particularly tough week at work. As we caught up, my dad casually asked about my plans for the evening. I mentioned a party, and that's when the mood in the room shifted. My cousin exchanged a peculiar look with my dad before revealing that something unusual had been happening on the res over the past few nights. They had been responding to calls from a woman who claimed that someone was knocking on all the windows of her house. The strange part? There was no one to be found when they arrived, not even footprints in the mud around her home. Initially dismissing it as teenagers playing pranks, they soon realized it wasn't an isolated incident. More people on the res were experiencing the same knocking phenomenon, sparking rumors of supernatural causes. The turning point came when a neighbor, visibly shaken, approached them and shared what he had witnessed. He described a black figure with humanoid features standing outside the woman's window, a window that seemed impossible to reach without stepping through a large mud puddle. The figure moved with unnatural speed, knocking on every window before disappearing into the woods. By the time Friday rolled around, stories of eerie sightings and encounters were circulating throughout the community. The descriptions of the creature were consistent, a shadowy figure with yellow eyes and sharp teeth. The air was thick with a sense of unease as everyone tried to make sense of the inexplicable events. Despite the warnings from my dad and cousin, I decided to attend the party later that evening. As a member of the native community, I held a belief that negative energy attracts negative energy, and being a spiritual and self-aware person could offer some form of protection. Little did I know that the night would unfold into a chilling experience that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. At the party, the conversation quickly shifted to paranormal experiences. While I was curious to hear others' stories, my attention was divided as I tried to console a friend who was grappling with personal emotions. Meanwhile, tales of sightings and encounters with the mysterious entity, nicknamed Coco G, short for monster in Alga-Chin, filled the room. One partygoer, related to the neighbor who initially reported the incidents to the police, shared his ordeal. Fearing the malevolent spirit's presence, he sought guidance from elders in the community, smudging his entire home for added protection. The elders, drawing from the rich tapestry of native beliefs, speculated that the spirit had crossed over due to an unauthorized shaking tent ceremony happening on the res. The shaking tent ceremony, a spiritual practice with similarities to a Ouija board session, was traditionally conducted under specific circumstances. However, someone on the res had been performing these ceremonies without proper guidance, potentially inviting malevolent entities into our world. As the party unfolded, one intoxicated individual brazenly taunted the spirit, inviting it to show itself. Unbeknownst to us, this act would set off a series of events that would plunge the night into darkness. Leaving the revelry momentarily, I stepped into the living room to console my crying friend. It was then that I noticed the rocking chair on the porch, eerily moving back and forth on its own. Instinctively, I averted my gaze, adhering to the native belief of ignoring paranormal experiences to deny entities the energy they sought. However, the rocking chair persisted in its unsettling motion. My peripheral vision kept catching glimpses of the eerie spectacle, but I resisted the urge to acknowledge it. Minutes passed, and the sense of unease lingered, but I refused to succumb to fear. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the uneasy calm. My friends rushed to the scene, discovering that the friend who had been crying earlier claimed to have seen the shadow spirit, Coco G, just outside the window. Panic ensued, and one brave soul burst through the French doors, determined to confront the entity. I took charge, ushering the inebriated teenagers inside, determined to maintain a semblance of control. As we cleaned up the aftermath of the party, knocking sounds echoed from the windows, heightening the tension in the room. The sunroom, with its glass walls, offered no respite from the unseen forces. I sought answers from the friend who had confronted the entity earlier, and his stern demeanor conveyed a sense of urgency. "It's outside," he whispered, prompting me to expedite the cleanup. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and the once defiant partygoers now scrambled to leave. Trash bags in hand, we cleared the remnants of the evening, all the while hearing knocks on the windows. I maintained composure, echoing the native wisdom of ignoring the malevolent energies seeking a reaction. As we piled into the trucks, the atmosphere remained charged with tension. My friend, who had encountered Coco G earlier, suddenly shoved me into the truck. We sped away from the cottage, leaving behind an unsettling night that defied explanation. Days later, I had the chance to hear the story from the perspective of the friend who confronted Coco G. He recounted the intensity of locking eyes with the shadowy entity, feeling an unspoken challenge to defend those around him. Running toward it, he witnessed Coco G dart into the woods, mocking him with a malevolent grin. The entity continued to haunt him, appearing by the truck as we left the party. The sightings persisted on the res for a few more days, with rumors spreading of similar encounters in neighboring communities. It was as if Coco G, the malevolent shadow, was on a journey northward, leaving a trail of fear in its wake. Now, in 2018, the paranormal disturbances on the reservation have ceased. No one else on the res has reported sightings of Coco G, and a collective sense of relief has settled over the community. Yet, the memories of that fateful fall in 2011 linger, a testament to the enduring connection between the spiritual realm and the tangible world on the Algonquin First Nation reservation. As a kid, my dad and stepmom took me on a camping trip to a tiny cabin in the mysterious wilds of northern Ontario. Despite the strange occurrences I'm about to share, this trip was one of those bonding experiences that formed the cornerstone of my relationship with my dad. Before diving into the weirdness, let me assure you that it was, overall, a good experience. The cabin, nestled on the shores of a secluded lake, was a rustic haven far from the typical cottage country near Toronto. Getting there involved a boat ride, emphasizing the remoteness of our chosen spot. Now, let the strange tales begin. Our adventures often involved a canoe left by the cabin's owner. I, being a nature-obsessed kid, reveled in exploring the marshes that surrounded the lake. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we paddled back through one of the marshes. That's when I heard it, a faint humming, like a distant transformer, emanating from the tree-line. My dad and stepmom noticed it too, and as it grew louder, an eerie silence enveloped the surroundings. Birds, frogs, and other wildlife fell mute. The humming ceased abruptly, leaving us with a chill down our spines. The lake had a rocky shore, but a sandy paradise awaited once you ventured into the water. This is where my dad, ever the resourceful outdoorsman, decided to catch freshwater mussels for a meal. Little did we know, our excursion would take a bizarre turn. While wading through the water, I glimpsed something among the trees on the opposite shore, a lanky, white figure moving lethargically. I alerted my dad, but by the time he looked, it was gone. I remained unsure if I'd imagined it, but the doubt lingered. In another episode, my dad recounted an unsettling experience from a canoe trip to a peninsula. The place was covered in mushrooms, and strangely, live trees gave way to dead ones. A putrid smell hung in the air, prompting them to turn back, avoiding the area for the rest of the trip. Then, there was my dad's solo hike into the woods. Suddenly, everything stopped, no sounds, no movement, just an eerie stillness. It lasted a minute or so before normalcy returned, leaving him shaken but with no other notable events. Our nights were spent around a campfire, but one evening, while watching X-Files on a tiny black and white TV, how the cabin had power remains a mystery, we heard that faint humming again. Intrigued, we ventured outside with a flashlight, but the source remained elusive. The next morning, our water wasn't working, and upon investigation, my dad discovered the pump's power cabling had been tampered with, an unsettling coincidence. However, the most chilling encounter happened in the early morning. I often woke up before everyone else, eager to explore. One sunrise, as I lay in bed, I saw a half-face peering through the window, sickly pale orange with enormous black eye sockets. It wasn't human. Terrified, I hid under the covers, and when I woke again, the strange apparition was gone, leaving me questioning my own senses. In a recent conversation with my dad, he admitted feeling uneasy during the trip. He even refrained from his usual morning jogs because an indescribable something unsettled him. Connecting this with my window incident gave me pause, making me reflect on the entire bizarre adventure. I may not have concrete proof of what occurred, but I don't share these stories lightly. There's something about that Northern Ontario cabin that lingers in my memories, a place where the boundary between reality and the inexplicable blurred. It was a summer tradition for my family to gather at an old campsite nestled in the secluded sticks of Missouri. The campsite, owned by a family friend, sprawled across 20 acres of raw land along the Mississippi. Miles away from any town, this rustic haven boasted a pool, cafeteria, mess hall, gymnasium, and a cluster of 10 cabins. The site also harbored an intriguing piece of history, an old plantation house converted into a stop on the Underground Railroad, complete with a secret room behind the fireplace that once sheltered escapees. Generations of my mother's family had visited this camp, a tradition dating back almost a century. Signatures of past campers adorned the cabin interiors, creating a historical tapestry that bore witness to the passage of time. My aunt, female cousins, and I found ourselves sharing one cabin, while the men occupied another. However, my brother and a brave cousin decided to venture off to a cabin up the hill, seeking solitude. Little did they know, their night would be far from restful. As the day's activities wound down, we gathered in our cabin, pushing beds together to create a makeshift megabed. I lay on the bottom bunk, closest to the half-screened wooden door, while my cousin Allison claimed the top bunk. 2 other cousins nestled in the beds to my right. As we exchanged stories, laughter filled the air until we eventually succumbed to sleep. In the dead of night, I awoke for no apparent reason. My eyes fixed on the door, where I noticed blonde/whitish hair bouncing around outside. My initial thought was that my brother and his big blonde afro were goofing around. I dismissed it and drifted back to sleep. A second awakening jarred me from my slumber. This time, I witnessed a complete apparition of a woman standing in the center of the cabin. She seemed almost tangible, about 85% opaque, dressed in 19th-century working-class attire, a long-sleeve dress, apron, and a disheveled bun. Her confused gaze surveyed the room, as if questioning our presence. Oddly, I didn't feel threatened. Instead, an inexplicable calm settled over me. In a reflexive moment, I grabbed my flashlight and whispered, "What?" The beam of light hit her, and in an instant, she vanished. Bewilderment engulfed me, but fatigue led me back to sleep. The next morning, a gradual realization dawned upon me. Despite the eeriness, I hesitated to share my experience, fearing it would be dismissed. However, my cousin Allison beat me to it. She had witnessed the spectral woman too, observing her silently before my flashlight disrupted the encounter. To our surprise, we were the only ones who had seen her. Recounting our story to the family sent shivers down everyone's spines. Despite the initial shock, the consensus was clear: we wouldn't return to the campsite. The unspoken assumption lingered that no one would want to revisit after what transpired. In retrospect, Allison and I pondered the possibility that we shared some sensitivity to such energies. She, more than I, believed in honing this ability. Whether a sensitivity or a one-time encounter, the woman in the 19th-century garb left an indelible mark on our memories. As Mort shared his own cabin experience in New Zealand, I couldn't help but wonder if, one day, I'd muster the courage to revisit that campsite and unlock more secrets of its mysterious history.